Welcome to EFT Nation, your home for all things tapping. For show notes and resources, please visit EFTtappingtraining.com. We are your tapping hosts. I'm Alina Frank.
And I'm Craig Wiener. The information provided in this podcast is not a substitute for counseling or medical advice. The information presented here is meant to inspire and educate listeners, but are not guarantees of any kind.
All right. So we're back with another episode of EFT Nation.
Great to be back.
Yeah. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about the living a life on a roller coaster during COVID-19, and especially with regard to feelings of grief and loss that can show up in so many different ways during this period for people.
Yeah, I think what has struck me and what made me really want to focus on this is that I've talked to many people, my friends, my family, my clients, and most of them are feeling this kind of a roller coaster wave of different emotions. It's like some days are really good, some days they feel down, some days they feel motivated to do things, other days it's like I just want to be on the couch and binge.
Yeah, and I've spoken with some that are going through waves of like acceptance.
Right.
And then just a little something, a news report, something, and
Boom.
anger, and boom. And then all of a sudden it goes from that into a feeling of loss and disconnection and aloneness and solitariness, especially depending, because everybody has different situations as far as their living and family. And, you know.
So what could you be grieving right now? So you could be grieving. So we're going to focus on grief, because there are all these different stages. And I think that that's a good kind of a model to look at what could possibly be happening in this emotional roller coaster.
So I think most people, when you say grief, right, it's loss. And it's mostly used
the death
with the idea of the loss of someone, the loss of a relationship, the loss of somebody's life. And so, of course, during this period of time, you know, we're here in the US, over 50,000 people have died, that's known. And so you may be touched by that, or a family member or friend or somebody you know, and there's certainly maybe that grief going on. And we're going to include that. But I want to expand this idea of grief and loss that might be the loss of.
All right. So what could you be grieving right now? A loss of a job, an actual job, or your
or
finances. Have you are invested in the stock market, let's say. So it could be the actual loss of all of that.
The loss of funds, the loss of work, the loss of a job, the loss of connection with people at work, and the day-to-day schedule of what you're used to with your work and vocation.
How about the loss of the freedom to go out in public and do what you want and go where you want and see who you want. All of that.
Boy, I am hearing and seeing a lot of that on social media. You know, there's either anger or this real feeling of grief and loss around. And it depends where you live and what you're not able to do and connect with. For some people, you can't go to the beach, you can't go to the park, all of those things.
If you are a kinesthetic processor or an extrovert, then I would say that you could be feeling that kind of a loss more deeply. Okay, so that covers like what could you actually be grieving now that's real, that is in fact something you can point to. But then there's this whole category of what we're going to call anticipatory grief.
What's that?
It feels like anxiety. It's like your mind is racing, there's sleeplessness. And this is about what might happen to our friends, what might happen to our family, what might happen to our finances, to our future, to our health, to our whole society.
So in other words, we're projecting forward based on the information, the unknown, the uncertainty, what we're watching in news reports around the world, not even what we've lost right now, but what might continue to be lost or even more loss that hasn't happened yet, and we're already projecting grief based on the future things that haven't happened.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's
go through some of the stages. And this model was made famous. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross designed it. There have been some adaptations, and one of the revisions that she came out with before she passed was the idea that this isn't linear. Because we used to think of it as, oh, we go through this stage and then we go through that stage of grief and then we're moving on. And she came to the understanding that no way, it's not linear. It's never linear. You can bounce back. You can skip stages altogether. And I think that is what made me think of, oh, this is probably grief that many people are feeling.
This kind of
bouncing back and
yeah. So it's not just a straight train ride.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and this model that I've read is like, it has actually some things that you might not hear from the original model, but let's go through them. So the shock of hearing the news that this was going to happen. So that shock moment, we call it the Uden moment.
Well, somehow, and it could be different for different people,
right?
How it affected you that, wow, something is really different here. And now there's a real loss of something that I can't have.
Right.
It's like hearing about it, I think often was like, yeah, it's happening there. And then suddenly it's hitting you and you're at home and you're not doing whatever.
Right.
So there's some sort of shock element to that, even though, you had inklings.
Right. So we're going to call that a Uden moment, unexpected, dramatic, isolating, no resources.
Right. Because it makes you feel kind of helpless and isolated.
Yep.
And surprising to you personally on some level. Yeah.
Yeah. So it would be good to write down that moment or moments like that you can chop through. All right. Next is denial. And so what you could be hearing out there, or we actually heard it really early on, with all this going down, I heard a lot of denial. So I heard people saying, oh, it's just a flu, or the numbers aren't that bad, or
it's not going to hit this community.
Exactly. It's not going to affect me. It's not going to affect, those I love.
Right. It's only going to affect a different age group or a different one that's immunocompromised, but it's not, but not me.
Exactly. So that's what you'll hear out there that will absolutely be about denial.
And you can see that in individuals and in communities.
Yes.
And in nations. And I mean, this really can be looked at on a much bigger
on the
scale,
collective, right? So next stage is anger. Like Craig was saying, like and I want to say that anger is such an interesting emotion because it really comes out of our desire to gain control. Like there's shock, there's denial, then the anger comes in when we're suddenly feeling like, oh boy, I don't have this under control. There is no one feeling like I that is helping me to find a sense of control and understanding about this. So anger is often an attempt to overcome our fears, and it feels more empowering. And so anger in this case will sound like, it's so-and-so's fault. Mm-hmm. Or screw the order to stay home. I'm going to do what I want.
Yeah, that ability that somebody's intruding onto my boundaries, my liberties, my freedoms, my choices, etc., is a natural inducer of anger as part of the grief response. Right. I mean, you may not be going through grief and still feel anger anyway. I'm not saying just because you feel angry, you're grieving, but it's an important element of the grief process.
Right. All right. Next, we have bargaining. Mm-hmm. And that's when denial starts to finally lessen as you're just like, oh, okay, this is the new reality. But we still want to hold to some illusion of control by bargaining. I was talking to someone who absolutely should not be going out in public. I mean, they have so many pre-existing conditions and so many health issues, and even the ability to walk is compromised. And this person went shopping. And I heard the bargaining when, she was saying, oh, I trust that that particular store, those employees are really clean. And, I was there, first thing in the morning. And so there's this bargaining that's happening for some people, when she could have very well asked, dozens of people that would have absolutely in a heartbeat said, yes, I'll do that for you.
Mm-hmm. And that bargaining your way out of feeling the grief is like, because if I didn't bargain or manipulate or somehow rationalize, then I'd have to feel that lack of control,
right?
Or that anger.
Exactly. All right. The next stage is depression. And some people call this despair. And that happens when we finally see that there is just no way around the situation. You finally see that, oh boy, I am not making any money. My rent is overdue. And the feeling of I'm going to be homeless soon. I just don't know how I'm going to make ends meet, and I'm going to be kicked out on the street. So that feeling of despair and depression could be what you're feeling going through all of these different stages.
Yeah. Finally, there's one last step.
Yes.
Step of acceptance, right? And finding some meaning in why all this happened. It's interesting because actually last night I was writing in a forum online and was speaking really from a place of, actually, I'm good. You know, I happen to be fortunate and blessed enough, done my work, all of that, in such a way that really right now, there's a place for me of acceptance. This is what is. There's a higher purpose for this. I see where it's going. But when people go through grief, usually the last and final stage, when they feel complete with it or integrated with the loss, there's a place of meaning making and understanding for why this may have happened at this time, what the greater purpose is in it for them. And so that, you know, it may be non-linear, but for me, that's usually when I see people grieving, the last step in the healing process of grief.
Yep. Right. All right. So let's talk about some tapping tips. We told you that a good one is tapping on the Yuden, on the moment that you figured out this was something to be concerned about. Hearing some news that personally affected you, or even news that doesn't personally affect you, but for whatever reason is triggering you. It's making you feel anxious. So accepting how you feel, you know, there's just no right way to process grief, to process your pain, to grieve properly. So let's just get rid of that altogether and just accept what it is that you're feeling. So write down what you feel right now and what you are, that anticipatory grief about the losses you anticipate having. Write down those worst case scenarios. Don't deny them. Don't sugarcoat them or eat sugar to deny that you're feeling that. Trying to talk yourself out of it will just come back and kick you in the butt.
It does. And, you know, there's this tendency to not want to put attention on it.
Right.
It's like, I don't want to pay attention to that big elephant in the room. And often by doing that and letting it pile up, it just feels bigger and bigger and more overwhelming.
Yep.
So often by actually naming and clarifying, there aren't as many as you thought. Or at least now they're doable. They're in front of me. I can work with them.
Yep. So here, resources that people do help people feel better is, you know, finding what makes you feel better. What are your resources? What are the go-to things in your life that will help you get through this? So diet, exercise, meditation, regular tapping,
self-care.
Exactly. Extreme self-care at this point. If you want to be connecting with others because you're feeling that sense of loss of connection, then tap on your fears about being vulnerable and asking
for help.
Asking people for help, telling people how you really feel. It really does inspire the listener to share more deeply with you. The more vulnerable you are, the more that they're accepting of their own vulnerability, and you can absolutely deepen your relationships during this time.
And I know, for example, in my family members, connecting just even briefly once or twice a week or whatever that is, being able to ask if that's what you need, you know, that can be vulnerable, but it can also make such a difference in your well-being.
Right.
And tapping on, if you need to, for the vulnerability of asking, that what'll they think about me? They'll judge me. They'll think I am less than or weak if I ask, right?
All right. Finding ways to help those less fortunate so that you feel you can tap on your resistance to hoarding money, hoarding resources, hoarding toilet paper. All of those things are indication. It's an indication that you've got some fear going on. So it does help us to move through what we're going through when we look at people that are less fortunate and reach out and help. It really does help us.
Mm-hmm. And when we reach out and help, you might be an EFT practitioner listening, right? And you have people in your life that you're tapping with, family, friends, colleagues, clients, etc. Just also remember the importance of when you're tapping on the fears, don't overwhelm them with the fear of everything that's going to happen. Always please remember with your tapping, please be specific. I'm worried that I'm going to run out of toilet paper and there's not going to be any. And therefore what? Well, then I'll have to use paper. In other words, getting specific and chunking it down can be really helpful and not aggrandizing and making things feel quite so big.
You mean like even though there's a pandemic?
Tapping, even though I'm scared this pandemic, yeah, that would be an example of global, too big, too overwhelming tapping that will feel too big.
Exactly.
Right? Even though I can't go to and sit at the cafe where I like to sit at, and that makes me feel really separate, and I feel alone and isolated, whatever that is, that's specific.
That's the way to do it. All right. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us today at EFT Nation. And remember that you can find show notes and previous episodes at EFTtappingtraining.com.